year 897, Rome was no stranger to spectacle. The Eternal City had seen the triumphal parades of Caesars, the coronations of emperors, the processions of martyrs, and the pomp of popes. But even in that long catalogue of human strangeness, nothing could prepare it for what unfolded inside the Lateran Basilica one grim winter's day. For there, in a hall meant to echo with sacred hymns, the people of Christendom were summoned not to celebrate Mass, nor to witness coronation, but to attend a trial, one in which the accused was already dead. The man on trial was Pope Formosus, who had been Bishop of Rome from 891 to 896. He had been buried months earlier, his body laid in the earth with the rites of the church he had once led. Yet his successor, Pope Stephen VI, ordered that the coffin be opened, the corpse pulled out, and the remains dressed once again in the papal vestments. Formosus was to stand accused of crimes against the church, and in one of the most grotesque spectacles in all of medieval history, his corpse would be propped upon a throne to face judgment. Why? To understand that, one must look at the poisoned politics of late 9th century Rome. The papacy was not merely a spiritual office, it was the most powerful seat in Italy, and its influence reached across the continent. Kings and emperors sought papal approval to legitimize their reigns, and in turn, popes relied on noble families to secure their place in the hierarchy of the church. Alliances shifted with dizzying speed, and the line between spiritual authority and naked political calculation blurred until it vanished altogether. Formosus himself had been a controversial figure. Before becoming pope, he had served as Bishop of Porto, one of the oldest dioceses near Rome. He was respected as a diplomat and negotiator, but his political ambitions led him into dangerous territory. He was accused of abandoning his diocese, of conspiring with powerful nobles, and even of seeking the papacy unlawfully. Despite this, in 891 he ascended the throne of St. Peter, but his choices during his reign left bitter enemies. He invited Arnulf of Carinthia, a Frankish king, to march on Italy and seize control of Rome, crowning him Emperor of the Romans in 896. To his opponents, this was an unforgivable betrayal, an intrusion of foreign power into Italian affairs, a violation of Rome's independence. When Arnulf's campaign collapsed soon after, Formosus's enemies saw their chance. Formosus died in April 896, leaving a papacy deeply divided. His successor, Pope Boniface VI, reigned for only 15 days before dying under suspicious circumstances. And then came Stephen VI, a pope chosen with the backing of Lambert of Spoleto, the young ruler whose claim to imperial dignity Formosus had once opposed. Lambert and his mother, Egiltrude, wanted revenge, and Stephen, whether out of fear, loyalty, or opportunism, gave it to them. Thus was born the Synodus Horrenda, the Cadaver Synod. Stephen decreed that Formosus would be put on trial, not in absence but in macabre presence. His body was dug up, clad once more in the pontifical robes of white, crowned with the papal tiara, and placed upright in a chair within the basilica. To steady his lifeless form, attendants tied ropes beneath his arms so that he would not slump or fall. His flesh had already decayed, his face a grim mask of death, yet his accusers treated him as though he was still capable of hearing their words. Stephen himself presided as judge. He appointed a deacon to act as defender for the corpse, though it was little more than cruel theatre. The charges were read aloud, that Formosus had violated canon law by leaving his diocese to become pope, that he had perjured himself in oaths of loyalty, that he had conspired with foreign rulers, that his entire papacy was illegitimate. One can imagine the scene. A hall heavy with incense, yet tainted by the stench of death. Cardinals, bishops, and nobles gathered in uneasy silence. The living pope railing at the dead one, pointing to the corpse and calling him a fraud, a criminal, a blasphemer. Each question Stephen shouted was followed by silence, broken only by the shuffle of attendants propping up Formosus's rotting form, as though he might answer. It was not truly a trial. It was an exorcism of power, a ritual humiliation meant to erase a rival from memory. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Formosus was found guilty on every charge. His election to the papacy was declared null and void, his ordinations annulled, his acts condemned. To make the condemnation visible, Stephen ordered the corpse stripped of its sacred garments. The 3 fingers of his right hand, those used to give blessings, were hacked off. His body was dragged from the throne, cast down, and eventually thrown into a common grave. Yet the desecration did not stop there. Soon after, Stephen commanded that the body be dug up again and hurled into the Tiber River, as though to deny even the sanctity of burial. Witnesses later claimed the corpse washed up downstream, and that miracles were reported at the site, a sign for some that God rejected the injustice of the trial. But in that moment, for Pope Stephen, it was victory. He had satisfied Lambert and Agiltrude. He had erased the legitimacy of Formosus, and, by extension, undermined the authority of all who had been ordained by him. In humiliating a corpse, Stephen sought to rewrite history itself, to say that his enemies had never truly ruled, that their authority had been an illusion. And yet, in the grotesque theatre of the Cadaver Synod, Stephen sowed the seeds of his own downfall. For though he might have thought he had won, the people of Rome had seen too much. The Cadaver Synod, for all its grotesque theatrics, did not end with the humiliation of a corpse. Its echoes lingered through the streets of Rome, unsettling not just the clerical elite, but the common people who had crowded into the basilica to watch. For them, what had taken place was not justice, but desecration. They had seen a pope, the successor of St. Peter, the supposed vicar of Christ, dig up another pope and spit fury at his rotting remains. They had seen the mutilation of a corpse once revered as holy, the cutting of fingers that had blessed thousands, the dragging of vestments once believed sacred. What should have been a trial became a spectacle of madness, and in that spectacle, the authority of the papacy itself began to crack. Stephen VI had intended to strengthen his power by erasing Formosus's legacy, but instead, he had turned Rome against him. The sight of ropes holding a corpse upright, the booming voice of a living pope railing against dead silence, these images clung to the minds of witnesses like a nightmare. Rumors spread quickly that the corpse of Formosus had nodded in defiance, that it had spoken, that the river itself had carried him back in protest against the injustice. Superstition mixed with outrage, and soon whispers grew into open resentment. Rome in the late 9th century was no stranger to violence. The city was ruled as much by armed factions and noble clans as by spiritual authority. Papal politics were inseparable from the ambitions of powerful families and foreign kings. Yet even in such a climate, Stephen's actions stood out as deranged, a grotesque parody of law and religion. When news spread that the body of Formosus had washed ashore and was secretly reburied by sympathizers, the sense that divine judgment was at hand deepened. To many, it was not Formosus who had been condemned, but Stephen himself. And indeed, the backlash came swiftly. Within months of the synod, riots broke out. The same mob that had once cheered Stephen's ascension turned against him. The noble families who had supported him saw that his hold on Rome was slipping, that the grotesque spectacle had undermined his legitimacy instead of cementing it. His enemies seized the chance to move against him, and in the summer of 897, Stephen VI was arrested. He was thrown into prison, the same fate he had once consigned to so many rivals. The papal throne, once surrounded by ceremonial grandeur, now seemed nothing more than a gilded cage. His enemies wasted no time. Before the year was out, Stephen was strangled in his cell, his body left to the silence of the dungeon walls. Thus ended the reign of the man who put a corpse on trial. But the story did not end with his death. Rome remained haunted by the Cadaver Synod, as though the city could not rid itself of the images of that grotesque day. The very act of condemning a pope posthumously had raised a dangerous question. If Formosus could be stripped of legitimacy after death, could not the same be done to others? Could the papacy itself ever be secure? Or was every pope vulnerable to the political winds that followed his burial? In the years that followed, the papal throne became a game of undoing and redoing. Successors scrambled to reverse Stephen's rulings, to restore legitimacy, to calm a church shaken to its foundations. In 898, Pope Theodore II convened a council that annulled the acts of the Cadaver Synod. He ordered Formosus's body retrieved from its secret grave, clothed once more in holy garments, and reburied with honor in St. Peter's Basilica. The gesture was an attempt to wipe away the stain, but the wound ran deeper than any ceremonial reversal could heal. Soon after, Pope John VI followed with councils of his own, denouncing the Cadaver Synod as a crime against the Church and forbidding any future trials of the dead. But the very fact that such a law had to be made showed how fragile papal authority had become. To forbid what should have been unthinkable was to admit that the unthinkable had already happened and might happen again. The papacy became a pendulum swinging between factions. Each pope who followed had to declare allegiance, either affirming the legitimacy of Formosus or condemning him anew. Some reinstated the ordinations he had made, others nullified them again. Priests and bishops who had been ordained by Formosus found themselves alternately empowered and disempowered, their very status in the church shifting with the politics of Rome. It was as though the church itself had fractured, caught between the living and the dead, between rival claimants to the throne of St. Peter. The people of Rome, meanwhile, remembered the Cadaver Synod not as a point of law, but as a nightmare image, a corpse propped up on a throne, ropes tightening under its arms, its skeletal face turned toward a living man screaming at it with rage. The grotesque theater had burned itself into the memory of the city, a symbol of what happened when power consumed itself in madness. And in that memory, the authority of the papacy suffered. For what was once regarded as holy was now tainted with ridicule. The vicar of Christ, instead of being a spiritual shepherd, had been seen desecrating a predecessor's body. The trial had not erased Formosus's legacy. It had corrupted the office itself, making it seem fragile, unstable, vulnerable to the whims of politics and personal vengeance. Even centuries later, historians would struggle to make sense of it. Some would argue that Stephen was mad, driven by paranoia or delusion. Others would say he was merely a puppet, carrying out the will of Lambert and Ageltrud, seeking to rewrite history for the sake of imperial politics. Perhaps both were true, but what mattered most was not Stephen's motives, but the image he left behind, the papacy itself reduced to grotesque farce. And so the Cadaver Synod lingered, a stain on the church, a story too macabre to forget, too unsettling to ignore. In the silence of St. Peter's tombs, where the bones of popes lay side by side, the memory of one pope put on trial by another, whispered through the ages like a curse, a reminder of how far power could drag even the holiest of offices into madness. The Cadaver Synod did not simply vanish into the obscurity of medieval intrigue. It became a scar etched into the collective imagination of Christendom. Though popes and councils moved quickly to annul its decrees and to rebury Formosus with honor, the grotesque memory could not be annulled, nor could the faithful so easily forget the sight of the papacy tearing itself apart in such macabre theatre. For years afterward, the papal court was forced to revisit the legacy of that trial, not because they wished to, but because its consequences refused to die. Priests and bishops ordained by Formosus were thrown into a perpetual state of uncertainty, at times declared valid, at times invalid depending on the political faction controlling Rome. Entire dioceses trembled on the question of whether their sacraments counted, whether their shepherds had authority, whether the hand of God could be undone by the decrees of men. Yet beyond the practical chaos, the synod endured as symbol. Even in a century accustomed to bloodshed, betrayal, and the ceaseless shifting of alliances, the image of a corpse put on trial stood apart. It was not just that Stephen VI had desecrated a body, it was that he had transformed the very heart of Christian authority into a grotesque stage play. The papal throne, which was meant to represent the unbroken succession from St. Peter, had become instead a chair for the dead, a seat not of living authority, but of decayed mockery. To the people it felt as though the church itself had been placed on trial, as though Christ's own vicar had been exposed as powerless against the madness of ambition. And the madness did not stop with Stephen's death. In the years following his strangulation, Rome remained a battlefield of rival claimants. The Spoleto family continued to press their claim to imperial dignity, while Frankish rulers sought to assert theirs. Each new pope had to reckon with the ghost of Formosus, either condemning or rehabilitating him. Theodore II and John IX restored his honor, but in the following decade Sergius III, once a bishop deposed by Formosus, rose to the papacy and declared the synod valid once more, branding Formosus a usurper and a criminal. Thus the corpse was tried again, not physically this time, but in words and decrees, dragged through the halls of memory as though still tied to its throne of ropes. The cycle of condemnation and rehabilitation turned the papacy into a pendulum of legitimacy. Its authority weakened with each reversal. The people no longer knew what to believe. Was Formosus a true pope or a fraud? Were his sacraments real or void? Was the papacy a divine office or a prize to be seized and unseized by noble houses and their puppets? The unity of Christendom, already fragile in an age of invasions, famine, and feudal rivalries, grew even more brittle. Historians looking back saw the synod as a revelation, not just of Stephen's instability, but of the fragility of the papacy itself in the 9th and 10th centuries. The so-called Saeculum Obscurum, the dark century of the papacy, was one in which noble families treated the papal throne as their inheritance, installing popes and deposing them at will. The trial of Formosus, in its grotesque absurdity, was not an isolated madness but a symptom of deeper rot. The entanglement of the church with worldly power, the reduction of spiritual authority to the spoils of politics. Yet even in its grotesque horror, the Cadaver Synod proved enduring precisely because it was so unforgettable. Chronicles preserved it in a vivid detail. Later writers, from medieval clerics to Enlightenment historians, retold it as proof of corruption, of folly, of human cruelty at its most theatrical. For some, it was evidence of God's punishment upon a corrupt church. For others, it was a cautionary tale of what happens when politics consume religion. And for still others, it became a symbol of the absurdity of human institutions, capable of turning even death into a stage for power. Art and literature kept the memory alive. Illuminated manuscripts depicted the corpse of Formosus in papal robes, seated on a throne, his skeletal face turned toward the raging figure of Stephen VI. The trial was repeated in sermons as a warning against pride, against ambition, against the folly of trying to rewrite God's will. In time, the event transcended its immediate politics and became a parable, a story whispered not only in Rome but across Europe, of the day when the Pope of Christendom put another pope on trial beyond the grave. And yet, beneath all the retellings, the essential truth remained hauntingly simple. The trial had not truly been about Formosus. It had been about power, about the desperate attempt of one man and one faction to erase the past and secure the present. By condemning a corpse, Stephen had sought to rewrite history. By mutilating dead flesh, he had tried to kill not just a man, but a memory. But memory is not so easily slain. In attempting to bury Formosus beneath humiliation, Stephen instead ensured that his name would live forever, carried down the centuries not as a forgotten pope, but as the central figure in the most grotesque spectacle the papacy had ever produced. The synod lingered, century after century, because it revealed something timeless about power, that it does not stop at the grave, that it seeks to dominate even the silence of death, that it is never satisfied until every trace of opposition, living or dead, is obliterated. And yet in its very excess, power undoes itself. Stephen had won a victory over Formosus, but that victory devoured him, drove him into a prison cell, and left him strangled by the very hands that had once upheld him. The corpse remained silent, but in silence it triumphed, outlasting its accuser. And so, in the imagination of history, the Cadaver Synod became not a story of Formosus's disgrace, but of Stephen's downfall. It became a mirror held up to every age that sought to twist the past for its own ends, a reminder that the dead cannot be forced into submission, that memory will always rise from the river like a body refused by the current, demanding to be seen. The Cadaver Synod had ended. Pope Stephen VI, who once stood triumphantly over the rotting corpse of his predecessor, believed he had proven his might. He had silenced the name of Formosus, humiliated his followers, and terrified Rome into obedience. Yet history has a way of exacting its revenge, and what began as a grotesque display of papal dominance quickly spiraled into Stephen's undoing. The corpse of Formosus, after being stripped and desecrated, was dragged through the streets and dumped into the Tiber. For days the waters carried him, swollen and grotesque, drifting like a ghost along the currents that wound through Rome. To many citizens it felt like an omen that God himself had rejected this foul spectacle. But then, a miracle was whispered. The body of Formosus, so the tale went, was found washed ashore by monks. Quietly, reverently, they retrieved him and buried him in secret. His corpse, they said, refused to vanish. His presence lingered, as though even death could not erase the injustice done to him. Meanwhile, Pope Stephen VI began to unravel. At first he proclaimed his victory with arrogance. He boasted that the enemies of the papacy had been crushed, that even the dead would be forced to kneel before Rome's living pope. But Rome itself seemed to rebel against him. Famine and unrest swept through the city. People whispered that the city was cursed for what he had done. Statues were said to tremble, and storms broke across the Tiber with unnatural violence. And then came the people's fury. The very crowds who had once gathered to jeer at the corpse of Formosus now turned against Stephen. Perhaps they had enjoyed the spectacle at first, but as weeks passed, disgust grew. Priests murmured that it had been a crime against God, an abomination to desecrate the body of one who had held the papal throne. The people of Rome, fickle but passionate, now demanded vengeance. By the summer of 897, the rebellion reached its peak. Stephen VI was seized by an angry mob. The Pope who had placed a corpse on trial was dragged from the Lateran Palace and thrown into a prison cell. The irony was complete. Once he had presided over a sham trial of the dead, now he would face no trial at all. The mob stormed his cell, strangling him to death in the darkness. His body was tossed aside like that of Formosus, as though fate itself demanded symmetry. Yet the Cadaver Synod did not end with Stephen's death. It echoed through Rome like a curse. His successors, eager to distance themselves from the madness, declared the trial null and void. Pope Theodore II restored honor to Formosus's name and reburied his body with dignity in St. Peter's Basilica. Pope John IX later convened synods to officially condemn the Cadaver Synod, banning any future trials of dead men. But the story was not so simple. For in the chaos of the early 10th century, the so-called Saeculum Obscurum, the dark age of the papacy, the memory of Formosus and Stephen VI continued to haunt politics. Factions in Rome resurrected the controversy again and again. At times Formosus was condemned anew, his ordinations declared invalid. At other times he was celebrated as a martyr. His corpse had been the plaything of Stephen VI, but his memory became the weapon of generations of rival factions. Even centuries later, the Cadaver Synod remained a symbol of the grotesque extremes to which power struggles could descend. Chroniclers in monasteries whispered of it with horror. Artists painted macabre depictions of the trial, of a corpse propped up in pontifical robes, while a living pope raged against him. Writers used it as proof of the corruption of Rome, as evidence that the papacy had once lost its soul in madness. And yet, there was also something deeply human in it, for beneath the horror lay the truth: fear. Stephen VI had not placed a corpse on trial out of simple cruelty, but out of terror. He feared Formosus's legacy, feared his enemies, feared that his own reign was fragile. He believed that by destroying even the memory of his predecessor, he could secure his throne. But in trying to erase history, he became history's most grotesque lesson. The Cadaver Synod lives on because it asks a question that has haunted rulers for centuries. How far will power go to preserve itself? In that Roman courtroom of 897, a corpse was placed on the throne, its fingers curling stiffly, its skull sagging under papal vestments. Words were shouted, accusations thundered, and sentences pronounced. Yet in the silence of death, Formosus remained unmoved. His corpse bore witness to the futility of Stephen's rage, to the absurdity of human ambition. For in the end, Stephen was dragged into the same grave he had mocked, and Formosus was restored to the dignity Stephen had tried to strip away. The Cadaver Synod was more than a grotesque trial. It was a mirror, showing Rome the madness of its politics, the desperation of its leaders, and the fragility of human power. And though centuries have passed, the image still lingers, a pope screaming accusations at a corpse, and a corpse that said nothing, but whose silence has outlasted them all.